So, and what I'm going to do here is first to examine the relationship between our conceptualization of active citizenship and the human rights discourse, and more specifically the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Secondly, I will show you some of the main trends in the EU and EEA member states redistributive policy provisions for persons with disabilities in the last decade, and show you some of the trends and differences between European countries. And finally, I will make an argument for a process perspective on the realization or implementation of the CRPD and the importance of involvement of disabled people's organizations in the implementation of the CRPD, and effectively also the gradual realization of the opportunities for active citizenship for persons with disabilities in Europe. And why do we want to focus on active citizenship? Well, first, in contemporary Europe, many persons with disabilities and disabled people's organizations themselves have demanded more active involvement in society, in fact, in contemporary Europe, many persons are de facto denied the possibilities of full and effective participation today in the labour market, in policy making, and in the economy more generally, on an equal basis with others. And as mentioned, have the disabled people organization have themselves also demanded a change to that situation, and demanded to be more actively involved in policy-making processes, but also to have the opportunities to be active participants in the community and to benefit from all aspects of being an active citizen in society. On the other hand, European governments have also expressed concern that there's a need not only for disabled people, but also non-disabled people to become more actively involved in politics and in the local communities. And it has been partly been expressed as a economic concern, but also partly as a moral concern from European government's perspective. And potentially there's here also a conflict in views on what active citizenship should imply, or what it should mean for people from the perspective of disabled people's organizations, and what some European government has articulated as their visions for what active citizenship should or ought to be. So there's also need to empirically examine what are politicians' visions of active citizenship, but also what are the hurdles or barriers against the active citizenship of persons with disabilities. So we want to identify more effective ways to remove and prevent not only the physical, but also the attitudinal, social, and organizational barriers against the active citizenship of persons with disabilities. So what do we mean more by citizenship more generally? And here we rely on or lean to well-established conceptualization of citizenship in the social sciences. For instance, this one definition is as follows. Being a full and equal citizen is basically a question of practices, living a decent life in accordance with the prevailing standards in society, being able to act autonomously being able to participate in social and political life in the broader sense, and having civic orientations to the political community and to one's fellow citizens. And in a second different definition, goes as follows. Social citizenship is not only a question of entitlement, it also involves participation in all realms of public and societal life, not only in political institutions or bodies, but also in neighborhoods, at workplaces, in charity work, or voluntary organizations, and in social movements. And that obviously also include disabled people's organizations. So on this broad basis and as a broad understanding of what active citizenship means, we have first identified 3 different strands or traditions in the literature on citizenship. Broadly speaking, we find 3 idealized images of what active citizenship refers to in the scholarly literature. First, a broad tradition which has emphasized citizens exercising a range of rights and duties vis-à-vis the community or vis-à-vis other citizens or the state, for instance, by participating in the labor market or by completing the mandatory education or by participating in the mandatory military services. And this is an image of active citizenship that is perhaps especially prevalent in those inspired by the work of the British sociologist T.H. Marshall in what we have referred to here as a social liberal approaches to citizenship. And second, we find a more narrow conceptualization of citizenship or of citizens more as consumers, with an emphasis on citizens. The active citizens are exercising autonomy, freedom, and self-responsibility in relation to the community or the state. For instance, by choosing the provider of services themselves, by being equipped with vouchers to choose between different assistive technologies and so on, and with an emphasis, as I mentioned, on the citizen as a consumer that is shopping goods and services in the market. And this is what we refer to as a more market liberal or even libertarian approach to our understanding of active citizenship. And third and finally, we find what we refer to as a civic republican approach to citizenship, which we find, for instance, is associated with the work of people like the German sociologist and philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And we can happily recognize now that the second dog has arrived also safely, sound and safely, so that's very good. And yes, in this civic republican approach, citizens, it's an emphasis on citizens' participation in the deliberation of public policy, but also that are exercising co-determination and have an influence on the services that they need or are benefiting from. For instance, that the individual beneficiaries of social services also have an influence on the content on the services they need and are using. So in this third tradition, there is an emphasis on participation in political decision-making processes, but also in the implementation and actual use of the services. So, based on our review of the literature and our understanding of these three different broad traditions in the literature, we have distinguished between three main dimensions of active citizenship. First, what we refer to as a security dimension, which is about how public policy, and to what extent public policy is enabling citizens with disabilities to maintain a sense of security by making the effective use of the social rights meant to protect them against major risk and protect them against constant daily worries. And a second dimension is what we refer to as an autonomy dimension, with public policy is supporting citizens with disabilities in exercising self-determination and independent living, and with people are able to define their own needs and are allowed to define their own needs and making their own choices and pursuing the kind of life they have reasons to value themselves. And third and finally, we have focused on a so-called influence dimension, where the public policy is ensuring the conditions for disabled citizens to participate in decision-making processes, both related to accessibility in general and to the services or transfer they are entitled to or may want to receive. And also in involvement, to what extent disabled people are involved in policy-making processes more generally. So, while we are focusing on these three dimensions, we also recognize that there might very well be other dimensions and additional dimensions. But we also have been interested in the relationship between the three dimensions, not only to look at each dimension separately, but also how they interact or are dependent on each other. For instance, it's difficult to imagine that people will be able to live an autonomous life and to have an influence on their own life unless they also experience some degree of security and have a certain standard of living. So we have also been interested in the interdependencies, so to speak, between the different dimensions. Now, the CPD in the preamble states that the overall vision of the convention is to promote the full and effective participation in society for persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others. And we have argued in our publications that our conceptualization of active citizenship might be a way to examine and analyze how and to what extent the state parties to the convention actually are living up to that expectation, and also to look at the interdependencies between different types of policies to achieve that ultimate goal or vision. Jerome Bickenbach, for instance, and others have argued that our concept of active citizenship sits an uneasy relationship with a human rights approach to disability, and he argues, quote unquote, broadly speaking, this conception of active citizenship aligns with the human rights expressed in the CPD, but diverges from the CPD in adding the dimension of individual obligation to, in effect, take up the freedoms guaranteed by the CRPD. While highlighting essential human rights, the CRPD does not include individual obligations to take up and exercise these rights. The only duty bearer is the state. The individual is guaranteed the effective positive freedom to, for example, participate in political and community life, but not the obligation to do so. And granted, Jerome, a good friend of mine, is right in pointing to that the literature on citizenship has more been focused more on the balance between rights and obligations compared to the human rights discourse in itself. Nevertheless, we believe that the way our approach to active citizenship is showing a way how to build a bridge between the discourses, if you want, on citizenship and the human rights discourse on the other. So I think at least some readers tend to assume that when we're talking about active citizenship, we are adopting quite a narrow neoliberal conception of active citizenship, and that we are in practice moralizing about individual responsibilities and presenting, and that there's a hidden agenda here, that we are trying to present unreasonable and unrealistic demands to persons with disabilities. But we would argue that quite on the contrary, a multidimensional conception of active citizenship, as we have presented it here, provides rather an analytic tool to empirically examine and theorize about the interdependencies between policy areas to realize the overall objectives and visions of the CRPD. At least from a social scientist's perspective, it's an empirical question to what extent governments and national governments actually present moral or legal obligations to persons with disabilities, and how that is balanced against the rights and entitlements of persons with disabilities. It's true that the CRPD codifies the obligation of the state parties to ensure that the individual person has the real opportunities or effective freedom to live the life the person has reason to want for him or herself. But also we should be aware of that the CRPD in practice also will be implemented in different political contexts, where and at the interface of discussions about the needs and interests of individual persons with disabilities, and the interests of business and other stakeholders, the interests of employers, or even the interests of society at large. So rather than trying to ignore that this is the political landscape that the CRPD will be implemented in, it's probably better to make this explicit, that this is actually something people who are advocating the needs and interests or human rights or persons with disabilities will have to cope with and relate to in discussions with politicians and with other policymakers. So in this European project, we have been inspired by what Amartya Sen and Martin Nussbaum has called a capability approach. Very briefly, from a capability approach perspective, the key question is whether existing disability policies at the EU level and national level provide the conditions for transforming and converting the resources people have available into effective capacities or freedoms that allow individual citizens and citizens groups to act freely, to participate in society, and to be able to pursue the kind of life they have reasons to want for themselves. And I think one of the advantages of the capability perspective or approach is that it also addresses what we may refer to the key factors that need to be in place for persons to be able to benefit from the resources that they are equipped with, for instance, in terms of education or personal assistance and so on. So in the literature on the capability, in the capability perspective literature, Amartya Sen has himself started to identify the main sources for variations in that influence on to what extent people are able to benefit from the services and the resources that are available in society, and whether they are able to transfer or as he says, convert that into actual freedom or effective freedoms. So first he points to the variations in personal heterogeneities, the diversity in individual characteristics, diversity in physical and mental capacities, knowledge and skills, and secondly, the distribution within the family, for instance, the differences in families' abilities to support children and in education, or to provide income during periods when a family member is out of paid work. And third, differences in relational positioning, for instance, differences in culture, social norms, and conventions that are negatively affecting the respect of others, as well as a person's dignity and self-respect, and what Adam Smith has referred to, the ability to appear in public without shame. And fourth, he also points to what he calls the varieties in social climate. For instance, the quality, the variations in the quality of public services between European countries, and also in the variations in community relations, for instance, the hostility or to persons with disabilities, how that varies between countries around the world. And fifth and finally, he also identifies what he calls environmental diversity, for instance, how the different exposure to pollution also affect people's health and the risk of illnesses around the world. And I will return to these 5 dimensions later in my presentation of the findings from the DISCIT project. But as a point of departure, we have used his 5 dimensions as an inspiration also to identify and map how such factors are, and how they influence people's opportunities to be active citizens, and also we are also focused on the interdependencies or interaction between the different dimensions. So now I'll turn to and point to what the member states or the European countries are doing in these policy areas. And I'll just present a few slides that might give an impression of the differences we find between European countries in their approach and the differences in disability policies across Europe. First, it's been, and for practical reasons, I will here focus on only on the security dimension of active citizenship, as this is the policy area where we most easily have statistics available from Eurostat. And first, it has been a discussion in the social science literature with the European welfare states are declining in their generosity and are trying to cut back on the social expenses to meet, and if that is even necessary, to meet the demographic aging and the challenges associated with demographic aging, and partly also as a response to the financial crisis that especially the southern European countries have been affected by. A second question is whether European countries are interested and willing to invest in people with or persons with disabilities, whether European countries are willing and interested in investing in education and active labor market training and vocational training for persons with disabilities, or are mainly emphasizing or giving priority to so-called passive social security benefits. A third question is to what extent the policy reforms we have seen in Europe the last decade actually make a difference for the active citizenship of persons with disabilities. And let's just start first with one graph or illustration, and it's a figure which shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different columns. One from the Central and Eastern European countries, one for continental European countries, a third for Northern European countries, a fourth for Southern European countries, and then we have Western European countries, and a column for the total. And first we see that the Northern countries have the highest total spending on disability benefits, both cash benefits and services in kind, when we measure it as a percentage of their gross domestic product. And we see that in Northern European countries, including Sweden and Norway, they on average used 3.7% of their GDP in 2015 on disability benefits, compared to Western European countries, which basically refers to the UK, only used 1.3% of GDP on disability benefits in 2015. We also see that the total spending on disability benefits was reduced slightly in Western European countries and in Central and Eastern European countries during the last decade, but the bigger picture is that there was very few or moderate changes in the total spendings on disability benefits during this last decade. So overall, the financial crisis or the Great Recession seems not to have had a very large impact, at least on the total or bigger picture in Europe, at least when we measure it with these very crude figures. This second figure looks more specifically at the spending on means-tested disability benefits. So that means benefits people do not have an unequivocal right to, but how to apply for, and has to be tested against whether people have incomes or they could spend on the services themselves, or if they actually are in need of extra financial support from the government or the local authorities. So these are to the extent that people have means-tested rely on means-tested disability benefits. I would argue that they have a weaker social status or weaker position in negotiating access to services than if they had a social right or entitlement to the benefits. And we see that again we have the same different groupings of countries with the central, continental, northern, southern, western countries. And we see that especially in the northern countries there has been an increase in or shift from social rights or entitlements to disability benefits to a larger emphasis on means-tested disability benefits during the last decade. So there was a 15.8% increase toward a shift in priority to means testing in the northern countries during the last decade. But we also see that still Western countries, especially the UK, still has a much larger priority to means testing of disability benefits compared to other European countries. So in Western countries, 48.5% is spent on means tested disability benefits compared to only 1.4% in Central and Eastern European countries and 22% in Northern European countries. If there are any questions to the figures, please ask me, but I'll try to explain as best as I can. This third figure looks more specifically about to what extent the European governments are giving priority to cash benefits, to provide income support and security for persons with disabilities, or if they are giving priority to social services, for instance, to education, to active labor market policies, to personal assistance, and other services in kind. Again, we see that the northern countries, including Sweden, has a much larger priority to services in kind compared to, for instance, southern and western European countries. We also see that both continental European countries, including Germany, and the northern European countries, including Norway and Sweden and Denmark, have increased their priority to services in kind during this last decade. Figure 4 illustrates the effect of income transfers to persons with disabilities in Europe. And what here we refers to the poverty risk rates, which means that we ask to what extent are people at risk of earning less than 60% of the median income in the country after they have received their disability benefits or other forms of income support from the government. And we see that in the risk of living in poverty is the smallest in northern European countries, including Sweden and Denmark and Norway. And it's the risk of poverty is the largest in southern European countries and Western European countries. And also see that the effect of the transfer, of the effect of providing income support is the largest in the Nordic countries and in the Western countries. So it's this probably partly reflects the generosity of the benefits, but also I think for the Western European countries also reflects the needs level in perhaps especially in the UK on and the demand for disability benefits to be able to avoid living in poverty in the UK. So again, the northern countries here is in a relatively favorable position compared to other European countries. Fifth and finally, this is a more complicated figure perhaps. It's no longer the 5 different columns, but we have a curve which illustrates the relationship between to what extent the changes in policies in the countries have affected the change in the risk of living in poverty for persons with disabilities in Europe. And if you look at the upper left corner, you have Sweden. And the way to read this table is that every country that is on the left of the 0 means that they have reduced the spending of disability cash benefits the last decade. So all the countries on the left side here, they have in one way or the other reduced the disability cash benefits levels as measured in percentage of GDP during this time period. And Sweden comes out with a reduction of about 1 or 1.2% of GDP. And as an effect of this, you also see that the risk of living in poverty has also increased from during this same time period with about 15 percentage points. And you have, on the other, you have Norway on the other side, in the very right corner, which means that Norway has increased its spending on disability cash benefits during this time period with about 0.5 percent points of GDP in the last decade. But Norway is also above this 0 on this y-axis. So it means that Norway has increased its spending on disability cash benefits, but more people are actually also at risk of living in poverty in Norway the last decade than in 2015 than in 2006, which is a bit depressing, I would say. Yes, so you will see that basically it's quite a few countries that have actually reduced the spendings, but also quite on cash benefits, but also quite a few countries and also quite a few countries that have now experienced a higher level of poverty among persons with disabilities than in the past, or in 1 decade ago. So, after this big picture of the main trends, some main trends in the European countries, I'll turn to summarize some of the main findings from the DISCIT project. First, I think it's fair to say that many European countries have, after all, moved towards making active citizenship a reality for citizens with disabilities, although at different speeds and with different emphasis on security, autonomy, and influence, and certainly the historical deinstitutionalization of the services for persons with disabilities have played a significant role in that and continues to be important to, especially perhaps in southern and central European countries. But still many European countries are reluctant or demonstrate very little interest in investing more in the human capital of persons with disabilities, or to address deficits in institutional and policy design that hamper the active citizenship of persons with disabilities. And I would argue that European governments are unlikely to achieve more active citizenship among persons with disabilities unless they more clearly and more actively address the conversion factors and the relationship between them in a material sense, meaning of conversion factors. So, and one important finding, I think, from the many life course interviews we did in the DISCIT project with persons with disabilities. Altogether, we did some 217 interviews with people around Europe. I think one important finding is that often the opportunities for exercising active citizenship depend on a combination, a coordination of several factors. It was not only one key factor, but also often dependent on the relationship between these different factors. So in a DISCIT life course interviews, I think we find that the importance of not addressing the factors separately, but to look at how they interact and depend on each other. For instance, personal heterogeneity, such as diversity in health, impairment, and working capacity, and the distribution within the family, such as a gender division of care responsibilities. For instance, in the life course interviews, it was striking how family obligations or care for children influenced the lives of women with disabilities to so much greater extent than men with disabilities. How much more women with disabilities talked about the children than men with disabilities in the project did. And third, the differences in relational positioning, such as social recognition or misrecognition of the needs and demands of persons with disabilities. This clearly varied not only between countries, between northern and southern European countries, but also between different types of impairments, and often persons with psychosocial disabilities and persons with cognitive disabilities or intellectual disabilities were in a much more disadvantaged situation compared to persons with mobility or visual impairments. And fourthly, the varieties in social climate, such as national variations in redistributive and regulatory disabilities, influenced on the lived experiences of persons with disabilities. And I have already indicated this in the statistics I have shown you, how the disability policies in Europe also have influence on the poverty rates among persons with disabilities. And fifth and finally, the environmental diversity, such as differential accessibility of transport, the built environment, and access to information also were very, very present in the lived experiences of persons with disabilities across Europe. So, just a few concluding comments. I believe that the capability approach to active citizenship reminds me that we need not only to focus on changing the characteristics of the excluded person in a supply-side manner, not only to focus on providing services in cash and in kind to persons with disabilities, but also a need to focus on the environment, to focus on the prevalence of discrimination, on the lack of accessibility, and so on in the market, and also to address the behavior of employers and providers of goods and services. And second, the capability approach reminds us that the social and educational services also need to be accommodated to the diversity of needs and aspirations in the population, including persons with disabilities, to enable also persons with disabilities to benefit from both compulsory and higher education. And third, I think one important lesson is that process is perhaps as important as substance, meaning that it's important not only to focus on the status quo today, but also to what extent actually DPOs or disabled people's organizations are actively involved in consultations about the deliberation of public policy, both disability policy, but also in policies more generally, to ensure that one to larger extent possible avoid discriminatory practices. And finally, one should not limit the interpretation of active citizenship to more narrowly defined government-managed choice, but also examine to what extent people actually are provided by effective and substantial freedom in a wider capability sense of having the possibility to choose the life people have reasons to value and aim at themselves. Thank you.